The air inside the Los Angeles County Courthouse was thick, almost suffocating. The gallery was packed. Reporters scribbling in their notebooks, law students analyzing every movement, curious bystanders whispering among themselves. Everyone in that courtroom had already made up their mind about the young man standing at the defendant's table. Marcus Carter, 19 years old, stood beside his assigned public defender, hands tucked casually into his pockets. He wasn't slouched, but he wasn't rigid either. His posture was calculated, calm, confident, controlled. Too confident, perhaps, for someone facing grand theft auto and resisting arrest. Across the room, Judge Stephen Holloway adjusted his glasses and exhaled through his nose, flipping through the case file. The courtroom had seen its fair share of young men like Marcus. To him, this wasn't a trial, this was routine. Another defendant, another conviction. From the prosecution's table, Daniel Whitman, a seasoned prosecutor with an impressive conviction rate, glanced at Marcus before turning his attention to Officer Ryan Delgado, the arresting officer seated in the witness box. Whitman's suit was crisp, his tie perfectly knotted. His confidence radiated from across the room. "This will be quick," Holloway muttered, barely looking up. "I've got a golf game at 2. A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff, the stenographer, even a couple of jurors. It wasn't just a joke. It was a statement. Marcus Carter wasn't meant to win this case. But Marcus wasn't laughing. He let the moment pass, scanning the room instead. He noted everything, the smirk on Whitman's face, the relaxed posture of Officer Delgado, the way the jury shifted, already believing they knew the truth. This wasn't new to him. Marcus had spent his childhood watching court proceedings. Not from a textbook, but from real life. His mother, Denise Carter, had worked as a paralegal for over 15 years. He had grown up listening to stories about lazy defense attorneys, biased judges, and overconfident prosecutors who relied on assumptions more than evidence. He had watched too many people walk into a courtroom already, convicted in the minds of everyone present. He had studied how cases fell apart and, more importantly, he had learned how to break them apart himself. Judge Holloway peered down at him, the corner of his mouth curling in amusement. "What's the matter, son? You think you're some kind of legal expert?" His tone was dismissive, almost condescending. The prosecutor smirked. Officer Delgado sat up straighter. Marcus still didn't react. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, eyes steady. He could feel the weight of the entire courtroom pressing down on him, waiting for him to fold. But he wasn't going to fold. He wasn't here to play their game. Because in just a few minutes, he was going to change the rules. The courtroom fell into a stiff silence as Prosecutor Daniel Whitman stood from his seat, smoothing out the front of his tailored suit. He exuded confidence, the kind that came from years of convictions, from knowing the system worked in his favor. He took a step forward, his voice steady, authoritative. "Your Honor, the state will prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant, Marcus Carter, was caught in possession of a stolen vehicle, a 2021 BMW M5, just hours after it was reported missing." Whitman paced slowly toward the jury box, making eye contact with each juror as if sealing his case before it even began. Officer Ryan Delgado personally witnessed the defendant behind the wheel before he attempted to flee on foot. When apprehended, Carter had no valid explanation for why he was in possession of the stolen car. He paused for a beat, letting the weight of his words settle. Judge Stephen Holloway nodded, clearly satisfied with the directness of the argument. "Seems pretty straightforward to me," he said, adjusting his glasses. From the defendant's table, Marcus Carter remained still, expression unreadable, but inside he was calculating, analyzing every word, every inflection in Whitman's voice. The prosecutor continued, flipping through his neatly stacked papers. "Your Honor, In addition to Officer Delgado's sworn testimony, we have forensic evidence placing the defendant inside the vehicle. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel, the gear shift, and the driver's side door handle. Whitman turned back to the jury, his voice firm. The defense may try to paint this as a misunderstanding, but let's be honest. What kind of innocent person runs from the police? A murmur rippled through the gallery. The implication was clear. Innocent people don't run. Marcus resisted the urge to smirk. That was their argument. That was their proof. Holloway leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus. I assume the defense has something to say about this? Marcus glanced at the public defender seated beside him, a woman who had barely spoken 3 words since they entered the courtroom. She looked at Marcus hesitantly, waiting for his cue. Heels clicked. He didn't hesitate. He placed a steady hand on her arm, a silent request. She hesitated, then slowly sat back down. Marcus took a breath, straightened his posture, and turned toward Judge Holloway. Your Honor, I'll be representing myself. A hush fell over the courtroom. For the first time that day, Whitman's smirk faltered. Judge Holloway raised an eyebrow, intrigued. You'll what? Marcus squared his shoulders. His voice was clear, steady. I'll be defending myself. The room shifted. The game had just changed. A charged silence stretched across the courtroom. Judge Stephen Holloway tapped his fingers against the bench, staring at Marcus Carter with thinly veiled amusement. The boy had guts, he'd give him that. Prosecutor Daniel Whitman folded his arms, shaking his head with a smirk. You're serious? He asked. You really think you can defend yourself against a felony charge? Marcus met his gaze, unflinching. I don't think, Mr. Whitman. I know. A low murmur spread through the spectators. Even some of the jurors exchanged glances. Whitman exhaled sharply, stepping back toward the prosecution's table. This was unexpected, but not a threat. Judge Holloway sighed, rubbing his temple. Mr. Carter, representing yourself is a serious decision. If you do this, you waive your right to legal counsel. That means no do-overs. Are you sure you want to proceed? Marcus nodded once. Yes, Your Honor. Holloway studied him for a long moment, then shrugged. Suit yourself. He gestured toward Whitman. Proceed. Whitman wasted no time. He grabbed the police report, flipping to a marked section. All right, let's get back to reality. He turned toward the jury. The facts remain. Marcus Carter was found near a stolen BMW. He ran from the police. His fingerprints were on the vehicle. Officer Ryan Delgado saw him behind the wheel. These are not opinions. They are facts. Marcus, hands still in his pockets, took a slow breath. It was time. Your Honor, I have a question for the prosecution, he said, his voice calm but cutting through the courtroom like a knife. Whitman exhaled impatiently. Go ahead. Marcus took his first deliberate step forward. You said Officer Delgado personally saw me in the stolen vehicle before I fled, correct? Whitman rolled his eyes. That's what's in the report. Marcus nodded. Good. Then let's verify that. He turned to Judge Holloway. Your Honor, I'd like to request Officer Delgado's GPS logs from that night. If he was where he said he was, the data will confirm it. A shift went through the courtroom. Whitman's smirk faltered. For the first time, Judge Holloway sat up a little straighter. Mr. Whitman. Whitman hesitated. It was slight, but noticeable, and Marcus caught it. So did the jury. Whitman cleared his throat. Your Honor, Officer Delgado's statement was filed under oath. His credibility— Marcus cut him off, his voice sharper now. So, there shouldn't be a problem verifying it, right? The pause stretched a second too long. Judge Holloway sighed. Mr. Whitman, Does the state have any objection to obtaining the GPS records? Whitman clenched his jaw. Then, reluctantly, "No objections, Your Honor." But the shift had already begun. For the first time, the courtroom wasn't laughing anymore. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Prosecutor Daniel Whitman adjusted his tie, flipping through his notes with forced composure. The shift in power was subtle, but it was there. Marcus Carter had done something that shouldn't have been possible. He had made the prosecution hesitate, and the jury had noticed. Judge Stephen Holloway, tapping his gavel lightly, leaned forward. "All right, we'll request the GPS logs from Officer Delgado's patrol car. But in the meantime, let's proceed." Whitman nodded, regaining his footing. "Your Honor, while we wait for the records, let's not forget the physical evidence." He turned to the jury, voice smooth, rehearsed. The defendant's fingerprints were found on multiple parts of the stolen vehicle: the steering wheel, the gear shift, the door handle. He paced slowly, letting the weight of his words settle. "The defense may try to spin this into a misunderstanding, but let's be logical. When you touch something, you leave your prints. It's simple forensic science." The jury nodded slightly. It made sense. Whitman stopped and turned directly to Marcus. "So, tell us, Mr. Carter, how did your fingerprints end up inside a stolen car?" The courtroom fell silent, all eyes on Marcus. He exhaled, taking a step forward. "That's a great question, Mr. Whitman. But before I answer, let me ask you something." Whitman frowned, but gestured for him to continue. Marcus turned to the jury, his voice steady. "Let's say you walk into a department store and try on a jacket. You put your hands in the pockets, maybe zip it up, then you put it back and leave. A few hours later, someone steals that jacket. Should your fingerprints on it mean you committed the crime?" A murmur spread through the gallery. Jurors exchanged glances. Marcus let the silence stretch, then continued. "The car was parked outside a convenience store. I was there with 3 friends earlier that evening. And yes, I touched the car. I leaned against it, I opened the door, because it was already unlocked. But I didn't take it." He let the jury sit with that information. Then, with precision, he delivered the blow. "Mr. Whitman, is the forensic specialist who analyzed my fingerprints present in court today?" Whitman hesitated. "No." Marcus nodded. "So, you're using forensic evidence to try to convict me, but you didn't bring the person who processed that evidence? No chance for me to cross-examine, to ask about the chain of custody, to challenge its accuracy?" Whitman clenched his jaw. Marcus turned to the jury. "That's interesting, isn't it?" Judge Holloway sighed, rubbing his temple. He had assumed this would be an easy case. But now, for the first time, it wasn't so simple. The tension in the courtroom thickened. Prosecutor Daniel Whitman rolled his shoulders, gripping his pen a little tighter. He wasn't used to this. Losing control. He cleared his throat, determined to regain the upper hand. "Your Honor, while we wait for the GPS records, let's not ignore the fact that the defendant was arrested near the stolen vehicle. That alone is suspicious." Marcus tilted his head slightly, as if considering the statement. Then, in a measured tone, he responded, "Suspicious isn't proof, Mr. Whitman." The prosecutor's jaw tightened, but he pressed on. "It's more than just suspicion. The defendant was found blocks away from where the vehicle was abandoned. Why run? If you did nothing wrong." Marcus didn't hesitate. He turned to the jury, locking eyes with them. "Let's talk about that." He took a slow step forward. "You ever hear a car backfire late at night? Maybe a loud bang, and your first thought is, what was that?" He let the question hang in the air before continuing. "Now imagine you're a young black man in a neighborhood where cops don't ask questions first. Imagine seeing flashing lights, sirens wailing. Would you trust that they're there to listen to your side of the story? Silence. Marcus glanced toward Judge Holloway, then back to the jury. Or would you assume, like so many before you, that you're already guilty in their eyes? The weight of his words sank into the room. A few jurors shifted in their seats. Whitman forced a chuckle, shaking his head. Mr. Carter, this courtroom isn't about hypotheticals or social commentary. It's about facts. Marcus didn't flinch. Then let's stick to facts. He turned to Judge Holloway. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence a statement from the registered owner of the stolen vehicle, Raymond Whitaker. Whitman's face stiffened. Holloway frowned. The owner? Marcus nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Whitaker reported his car stolen and gave a statement to the police that, for some reason, the prosecution never introduced. Marcus took a deep breath, holding up a printed transcript. Then clearly he read aloud. I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off. But it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw him. He was white. The courtroom erupted. Whitman clenched his fists. The gallery was buzzing. Even Judge Holloway looked shaken. Marcus lowered the paper, his expression unreadable. The cracks in the prosecution's case were no longer just cracks. The entire case was falling apart. The courtroom was no longer under Whitman's control. The revelation of Raymond Whitaker's statement had shattered the prosecution's case, leaving cracks so deep they could no longer be ignored. Judge Stephen Holloway, once dismissive of Marcus Carter, now wore an expression of unease. Prosecutor Daniel Whitman, once brimming with confidence, now looked like a man trying to hold sand in his hands. And Marcus, he stood exactly where he had been the whole time, calm, steady, and in control. Holloway rubbed his temple before speaking. Mr. Whitman, does the state have any further evidence to present? Whitman hesitated, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. He had built this case on the assumption that the jury would trust the system more than the defendant, but now the system itself was under scrutiny. Finally, he exhaled through his nose and shook his head. No. Your Honor. A beat of silence passed through the room. Then Judge Holloway shifted his gaze to Marcus. Mr. Carter, do you have anything else to say before I make my ruling? Marcus took a slow step forward, turning to face the jury instead of the judge. This case was never really about whether I stole a car. His voice was calm, unwavering. It was about whether or not I could convince you that I deserved a fair trial. A hush settled over the gallery. I was arrested because I fit a description that no one bothered to check. I was charged because it was easier to assume I was guilty than to ask if the evidence made sense. He let his words sink in. The jury members weren't just listening anymore, they were thinking. But let's not pretend this only happens to me. He paused, glancing around the room. How many times has someone stood in this exact spot, accused of something they didn't do, with no way to fight back? No one spoke. Judge Holloway sighed. He had heard enough. He adjusted his glasses, then looked toward Marcus one last time before turning to the court. The charges against the defendant, Marcus Carter, are hereby dismissed. The courtroom erupted. Some people gasped. Others muttered in disbelief. The gallery stirred, and reporters frantically scribbled in their notebooks. Marcus didn't move, not yet. He let the moment settle. He had just done what most people in his position never got to do. He had fought back. And won. Judge Holloway sat back, still gripping his gavel. There was something new in his gaze, recognition, maybe even regret. Marcus turned to leave, but before he reached the door, Holloway spoke again. Mr. Carter. Marcus stopped, but didn't turn around. Holloway hesitated, then finally said, You should consider law school. Marcus smirked. He didn't need to consider it. He was already on his way. Outside the Los Angeles County Courthouse, the air was thick with voices. Reporters crowded the steps, their cameras flashing, microphones pointed in every direction. "Marcus, did you know the judge would dismiss the case? What are you going to do next? How does it feel to outmaneuver a seasoned prosecutor?" Marcus ignored them. He pulled his hoodie over his head, his hands tucked into his pockets as he made his way down the steps. He didn't care about the spectacle. He wasn't here to celebrate. This wasn't a victory. His mother, Denise Carter, stood at the bottom of the stairs, arms crossed. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes said everything. For a long moment she just looked at him. Then, finally, she let out a breath. "Boy, you scared me half to death." Marcus chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Had to take a risk. More." Denise shook her head, but her lips pressed together in something close to pride. "You sure did." A few reporters tried to push closer, shouting more questions, but Marcus didn't slow down. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, he caught a glimpse of Judge Stephen Holloway standing just outside the courthouse doors. For the first time, Marcus saw something in the judge's expression that hadn't been there before. Reflection. Maybe even regret. Holloway didn't say anything. He just watched as Marcus walked away. Because the truth was, Marcus shouldn't have won this case. Not because he wasn't innocent, but because the system wasn't built for people like him to win. How many others had been convicted, not because of actual guilt, but because the system was designed to move quickly, to assume, to convict. Marcus had the knowledge to fight back, but what about the ones who didn't? He thought about the others who had sat in that defendant's chair before him, the ones who didn't know the law, who didn't have the words to defend themselves. They were the ones he couldn't forget. He had walked into that courtroom alone, but he wouldn't be alone next time, because next time he wouldn't be the defendant. He'd be the attorney, and when that day came, he wouldn't be the only one. He turned to his mother. "We need to talk." Denise raised an eyebrow. "About what?" Marcus looked back at the courthouse. "How to make sure the next kid in that courtroom doesn't have to do it alone." Denise studied him for a moment, then nodded. Marcus took a deep breath, one final look at the place where he had just made history, then turned away. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The story of Marcus Carter isn't just about one wrongful accusation. It's about an entire system that too often presumes guilt before proving innocence. How many others have sat in that same defendant's chair, accused of crimes they didn't commit, without the knowledge or resources to fight back? How many convictions were made, not because of actual evidence, but because of assumptions, shortcuts, and a system designed to move quickly rather than seek truth? Marcus was lucky. He had the knowledge to defend himself. He knew the law. He knew how to fight back. But what about those who don't? This case was dismissed, but justice wasn't served just because one person avoided a wrongful conviction. The real question remains: how many more are out there, without a voice, without a defense, without a chance? It's not enough for just one person to win. We need to change the way justice is served. If this story made you think, even for a second, share it. Because the next Marcus Carter might not be a stranger, it might be someone you know. Hit that like button if you believe in standing up for what's right. Subscribe for more stories that matter. Drop a comment below. What do you think needs to change in the justice system? Let's keep this conversation going, because change doesn't happen unless we make it happen.